Hello. The FA Cup traditionally rounds off the English soccer season, and this year, after the tragic deaths of so many Liverpool fans on the terraces at Hillsborough, the match took on an additional emotional dimension. In this issue of Video World, we feature the Cup as a game and a national event, and our regular varied mix of documentary and entertainment. The enterprise culture looks at the effects of new entrepreneurial ideas on traditional British institutions, in this case, the beautiful Wiltshire village of Avebury. Then we have a highlight from Sue Lawley's spell on The Wogan Show. She meets Paul McCartney and his new band and talks to veteran Hollywood star Charlton Heston. As far as comedy is concerned, we have Nigel Havers and Tony Britton in Don't Wait Up. The series features Toby and Tom Latimer, father and son, living in the same house, both doctors and both with marital problems. But we begin with the topical subject of just how seriously Britain takes the idea of European unity. It's an issue that has split the Conservative Party. So with elections to the European Parliament imminent now, Margaret Gilmore tried to find out how deep these Tory disagreements go on Europe.
The row could hardly have come at a worse time for the Conservative Party, 1 month to the day before the European elections. Many of Britain's 45 Tory Euro MPs are concerned that those Conservatives who are spelling out internal differences on Europe now are simply damaging the party's chances on polling day. Their fears are compounded by the fact that in the run-up to the election, Labour is projecting a united front, not only in Britain but throughout Europe. In Paris, they've been printing posters. Labour movements from the member countries are fighting on a joint manifesto, which will be published hand in hand with their own individual policy documents. The Tories lost 1/3 of their Euro MPs last time round, while Labour doubled its strength to 32. And if the recent council elections in Britain are taken as a barometer, then the Conservatives could lose another 6 Euro seats next month. The party may have to pay a high electoral price for their differences.
The divisions in the Conservative Party may, at the moment, just be bubbling below the surface, but the risk is that if the government doesn't reach an accommodation with its European partners over the next, say, year or two, then we'll get real divisions in the Conservative Party, perhaps just before the next election.
Mrs Thatcher accepts that Europe needs a framework of regulation, but repeated her view that the Europe of the future needs to maintain its present variety.
And that is what the battle is really about. Is that vision going to enrich and inform the future, as it has given so much to the world in the past? Or is it going to sink into a detailed bureaucracy of standardization and harmonization?
Such talk highlights the fundamental differences between the Prime Minister and those who are closer to the Heath camp. On economic integration, for example, should Britain go along with plans for a common currency and a central bank? The government says no. On social integration, the issue of common policies on workers' rights, health and safety rules aroused differences between Mrs Thatcher and some of her Euro MPs. And there's the question of sovereignty.
At the Bruce speech last autumn, for example, she said that her vision of the future was a set of independent sovereign states cooperating together. That's completely untrue, because we are not independent sovereign states. We have a European Parliament, a European Court of Justice, a European budget. We do many things together. We've pooled our sovereignty already. So it's quite untrue and very misleading.
Signs of dissent came at last year's Tory party conference in September.
It is a single market which is also concerned with common currency, with a common monetary system, with a common bank. Oh, I'm glad that you approve and are cheering loudly.
On Europe, the Tory party was divided. Today, Mrs Thatcher was the focal point of disunity.
I think she should do as she has done, which is to nail her colours firmly to the mast. We have seen a transformation in the British economy over the past 10 years. We are now a truly entrepreneurial society. And I don't think that the British people want to see that lost in a welter of Euro red tape and bureaucracy.
She needs a different style. It's fine to fight Arthur Scargill and so on in the UK, and she's done very, very well. But it's no good going out fighting her allies on the continent. Of the 12 governments in the EEC, 8 of them are Conservative or her allies. And to go out fighting them all the time doesn't get us anywhere.
The former Defence Secretary Michael Heseltine, who many believe will eventually become leader of the party, falls in with those who've questioned Mrs Thatcher's approach to Europe, to a certain extent using his new book as a vehicle for this.
I think you have to place him closer to Heath than to Thatcher. And I think what he's been very careful to do in the book is to avoid direct criticism of Mrs. Thatcher. But if you read Heseltine's book against, say, Mrs. Thatcher's Bruges speech, it's pretty clear that it's an alternative manifesto for Europe.
The effect this internal Tory row over Europe is having on the electorate will become fully apparent once Britain goes to the polls on the 15th of June. Many Conservative candidates who are hoping for places in the Parliament are angry that the quarrel has been allowed to surface now. They fear it'll damage their election chances and make it significantly more difficult to operate amongst their European counterparts if they do get in.
Another controversy has been the threat of the bulldozer to the remains of the historic Rose Theatre. Shakespeare himself may very well have trod the boards of the stage, uncovered recently by archaeologists in Southwark. But the property developers who keep on discovering these hidden treasures have mixed feelings about it all, as Chris Moore revealed in the South East News.
400 years ago, London's Bankside, just south of Southwark Bridge, was notorious for its brothels and bear-baiting contests. Today, a different battle rages here, between the present and the past. These are the foundations of the Rose Theatre, where in the past 6 weeks archaeologists have unearthed the first ever tangible remains of an Elizabethan theatre, including the very boards which Shakespeare himself once trod.
The structures that do survive are in such a good and evocative form that they would be viewable both to scholars and to the general public, and I think they would be readily understandable. And I think the question of whether or not it is right to actually bury structures which are so directly connected with Shakespeare, both as a playwright and as an actor, and with Marlowe and with Johnson, they're so connected with them and are so connected with the history of the English theatre, I think we must consider very carefully whether the right thing is to bury them or to try and make something of them.
Just over the other side of Southwark Bridge, on the opposite riverbank, another historic site faces demolition by the end of this month. These are the splendid remains of a first-century Roman bathhouse, built by the governor of Britain, Agricola, possibly to keep the natives happy. The baths may also have been part of the governor's own palace, but in a few months' time, they'll just be the basement of an office block.
Given what we have found here, the remains of a very large first-century building, and now that we know the extent of it, it seems terribly wrong that it should be destroyed. The walls, foundations, and areas we have here are amongst the best which have ever been found, not only in London, but in the entire country.
But as with most modern battles, it's not clear who the enemy is. In fact, if it weren't for the developers who are paying for these digs, such sites probably wouldn't be explored at all. The question is, what happens once the digging is over? And who should pay for it?
We are talking here of very, very large sums of money. I mean, this is prime city office space. We're talking very, very large rentals. And I think we're talking in terms of several £1 million. You simply cannot stop development in an area like the City of London. You can try to negotiate with the developers, you can try to minimize the damage, and in this case we did try to minimize the damage on the information that we had at our disposal.
Unless in Britain we really operate the European code of practice, which actually makes sure that on archaeological sites their significance has to be evaluated and taken into account when a developer puts forward his planning applications, I don't think the situation will be improved radically until that does happen here.
Meanwhile, the campaign to save the Rose soldiers on, with all 3 local MPs united in support.
The most immediate thing is to get the government to designate North Southwark as one of the 6 areas of architectural importance, to schedule the site of the Rose Theatre, which will give more time for investigation and give it special protection, but then to agree that it is their policy, and English Heritage will have it as their policy too, that the theatre site must be preserved.
The man who built the Rose was no stranger to market forces himself. When the price of land soared in 1603, trebling his rent, he decided he'd really rather see the theatre pulled down. A man in tune with his time and ours.
The laws about ancient property also turned up in a debate in the House of Lords. Christopher Jones unearthed a story about common land that frightened Parliament into a remarkably quick response.
The Common Land Rectification of Registers Bill was given an unopposed second reading in the Lords on Thursday. That, on the face of it, is not a particularly thrilling piece of news, unless, that is, you're one of the 400 or 500 people scattered throughout the country who has tried to sell your house and suddenly found that the land on which it is built has been registered by somebody else and completely without your knowledge as common land. So you can't either sell the land or effectively the house that's built on it. Commons and Lords have come together quietly and with a minimum of fuss and delay to right an obvious wrong by putting a private member's bill through Parliament, which will mean that post-war houses will be taken off the register of common land and so will become normal saleable properties. The bill is being promoted in the Lords by Baroness Blatch on the Conservative backbenches.
There are people in this country who have found themselves registered as common, their homes and their land registered as common land without their knowledge, and therefore when they come to sell their property, for example, they simply can't because there's a constraint upon them that their land is registered as common land.
What sort of people does this happen to?
All sorts of people. I've had a case in only this morning of somebody who owns a property in Sussex, was on business in Sri Lanka in the 60s, came home and totally unaware that his neighbour had actually registered his home and land as common land. And he didn't discover this until 1987. And he can do nothing about it. There is no provision in the original Act of 1965 for him to apply for deregistration.
So anyone can just turn up and register your property and then you're completely stuck.
That's absolutely true. It's quite extraordinary that somebody can apply for registering your land as common land, and nobody has an obligation to tell you that your land has been registered. And therefore you can be totally unaware, blissful ignorance, and discover only perhaps when you come to sell your property that it has common rights over it.
Now, how come that you in the House of Lords have got involved in doing this?
Well, that's very simple. I was approached by Tony Favour to do it, and I was pleased on two counts. Firstly, I'm a relatively new girl to the House of Lords, and therefore taking a bill through the House just helps me to learn a little more about the ropes in the House of Lords, and so I'm pleased on that count. And secondly, the more I know about this bill, the more I'm enthusiastic about doing something about it.
So, Mr. Favour, from the House of Lords to the House of Commons, how did that come about?
Well, first of all, it came into the House of Commons. I introduced it as a private member's bill. And then having gone through its process in the House of Commons, like every other bill, the private member's bill goes to the House of Lords, where we hope, or I hope, that we'll find a helpful peer or peeress to deal with it, and Lady Blatch has very kindly agreed to deal with it for me.
Now, did you have to have in the House of Commons a full-scale debate with ministers and all the rest of it?
Well, normally you do, but on a case like this, I was able to introduce the bill, they say, from behind the Speaker's chair, and it went through purely on the nod. That's without anybody objecting to it on second reading. That in itself is rare, so I had to prime everybody fairly carefully not to shout object.
Just to shout object in the House of Commons means that's the scup of the bill.
That kills it.
Anything like that in the House of Lords, Lady Blatch?
Well, I think there may be an attempt, but I think it's very important that, first of all, there is to be a bill, a main bill about common land, and we want to do nothing to preclude that bill coming to the House. Everybody's expecting it to come. I understand it's due in this session of Parliament.
And the whole law about common land, which I imagine is very complex.
It's all under review, and I think that's very important. We simply want to right a wrong in the 1965 Act, and any amendment that would complicate this little bill that's going through now would possibly leave it, and it would have to wait until the next bill comes in. So we don't think this particular little bill will interfere with the main bill that we're expecting through in the House.
So this is the Lords and Commons getting together to try to protect the rights of the ordinary citizen.
That's right. It's almost a traditional role of Parliament, to right a wrong.
My Lords, it seems almost unbelievable that any person could apply for common land status of another person's land and property without there being a requirement to serve notice on the owner. Even with planning applications, a local authority is required not only to serve notice on the owner, but also to inform immediate neighbours. My Lords, this situation is wholly unacceptable and makes a nonsense of the saying that a man's home is his castle.
On the Labour front bench, Lord Graham of Edmonton fully supported the bill, but he warned against trying to extend its scope to deal with other possible wrongs.
From my experience in another place, it would be the height of folly and an exercise in futility if we in this House, on this bill at this time, sought what might euphemistically be termed to improve the bill which would provide some people, for one reason or another, with an opportunity to use the bill, not necessarily for our purposes, but for other purposes of delay and frustrate.
For the government, Lord Hesketh also approved of the bill, and he promised too that the government would legislate later on the wider issue of the law on common land. As for the changes in this bill, he hoped they'd become widely known.
If the bill is passed, it will be for the Secretary of State to make regulations, and we would hope to have them in place as soon as possible after the bill has been enacted. We shall consult on the content of the regulations on which departmental officials have already started work. And one matter which will be needed to be covered is publicity. We anticipate that the regulations will make provision for there to be publicity on site and in the local press, as well as notification to parish and other councils, interested owners and commoners, and to the Open Spaces Society. And my Lords, I hope that the speedy progress already made by this bill will continue, and I commend it to the House.
Television cameras have been allowed in the House of Lords for 6 months now, and that's soon to be followed by the experience of television in the Commons. Alenka Frankel went along to Granada Television's purpose-built mock-up studio to see how televising the House might work.
These are the kinds of scenes you won't be seeing on your television screens. The grunts, the howls, the yells of disapproval, the mace swinging, the acts of disobedience, the antics which you've heard on the radio as a regular feature of parliamentary life. These won't be seen on TV.
At present, there are no fewer than 5 higher rates of income tax.
Under the strict rules on televising Parliament proposed today, the scene you've just witnessed will look instead like this. The cameras will show only those speaking with the authority of the chair, or those seeking it. Wide-angle shots of the chamber may be used from time to time, but at the first sign of trouble, the cameras lock on the Speaker of the House as he tries to restore order.
I have no alternative but to suspend this sitting for 10 minutes.
The rules are really in practice a codified form of what is the best practice used by the broadcasters in the House of Lords, but they are particularly designed to make sure that anybody who seeks to exploit the televising of the House of Commons by misconduct or publicity shall not be able to do so.
The job of Parliament is to be shown as it is. It's no use to have no sense in having a sanitised view of Parliament being given to the public. Parliament is a place which is sometimes rowdy, which is sometimes argumentative, which is sometimes boring. And it's no use trying to artificially present a picture of Parliament. We need to see Parliament as it is, and I'm afraid that the present rules of coverage won't allow that.
There's to be no fancy camera work, no split screens, no shots of the press or public galleries. The rules say cameras may not pan across the benches. Those members who spend their days sleeping, knitting, filling out their football coupons have nothing to fear. Even those quietly listening to the debate may not be shown, unless they themselves are mentioned by another member during the proceedings. For the broadcasters, the ban on reaction shots is both editorially and technically the toughest restriction.
The House is a lively debating chamber, and responses and reactions on all sides of the House are an important part of the story that happens there, and we think these rules will not allow us to tell that story, and we also think that in time Parliament will come to appreciate that as well.
We'll see how the experiment goes, and it may be that we can change some of the things later, but no, we believe that it is the proceedings of the House of Commons which need to be broadcast and televised, and we didn't see any justification for these cutaway shots.
When a group of army colonels attempted a coup d'etat in the Spanish Parliament in 1981, the whole scene was caught on camera and the film used as evidence in their convictions. Under the current proposals in Britain, any such an event would go unfilmed. The report states quite clearly that under no circumstances may the directors depart from the regulations.
Now, I don't expect that to happen in Britain, but what I do know is that under the present rules of coverage, if that were to happen, all the television viewer would see would be a picture of the Speaker with his hands up.
Canada's House of Commons has been televised for 12 years. There, the restrictions are even tougher than those now proposed in Britain. But the coverage is regarded as of little interest to anyone, except the politicians themselves.
You are playing...
The effects of televising of the Commons has been beneficial to politicians primarily, because it has turned the show or whatever takes place on the front benches of the House into headlines. The other aspect is that the House has become much more disciplined, at least in a visual fashion. Backbenchers with their feet on their desks chewing gum and yawning is no longer seen in the House of Commons in Canada because they could be seen on camera.
When the two main players in that game, the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, lock horns in the traditional way over Prime Minister's questions, the excitement should be there for all to see on their TV. This skirmish 3 weeks ago in Canada over a budget leak proves that even under the strictest constraints, parliamentary debates can make good television.
Squeal a little more, that's all you've been able to do in this issue.
But these are rare highlights, and demand in Canada for parliamentary coverage is falling away.
We used to do an hourly program, now it's been reduced to half an hour, and we're even talking of reducing it to just a few minutes in the course of a weekly current affairs program. So obviously there doesn't seem to be an outcry across the country to see more of the House on television.
If the House approves today's proposals, as is more than likely, televising of Parliament will start with the Queen's speech, the next opening of Parliament. But as more countries televise their parliamentary proceedings, a pattern has emerged which suggests that the degree of control over freedom of the broadcasters can affect political balance. Where the rules are less strict, like West Germany, the opposition and the backbenchers may find an advantage. Britain's tough regulations may have the opposite effect.
A television regime which doesn't allow trouble or dissent to be shown is going to make it more difficult for the opposition to do its job. In other words, it's going to favour the government somewhat. It's also going to favour perhaps the front bench, both of the government and the opposition, as against the backbenchers, because front benchers can always be on their feet making speeches. Backbenchers would sometimes like to interrupt, would like to make their feelings shown, but the cameras won't be able to show what those backbenchers are trying to display.
They're our representatives in our parliament, and if we can see them at work, which we can through television, or hear them through radio, we should be able to see and hear them. As I can now, I can walk out of this interview along the embankment, queue up and get into Parliament. Why can't people do that all over the country by means of that lens?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to bring it to the attention...
It's taken years for the cameras to gain admission to the House of Commons. Now they're in, they'll have to move cautiously and curb the power of that lens, or soon find the doors, which have been so hard to open, shut firmly in their face once more.
Well, next to another traditional British institution, the Chelsea Flower Show. This year, say the experts, the exhibits have been better than ever. The Gardeners' World team went along, led by Alan Titchmarsh, to give their appraisal.
It takes just 3 weeks each spring to transform 11 acres of ground around the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, into the Chelsea Flower Show. Each of the 22 gardens has been built in just 15 days. 3.5 acres disappear under the canvas of the Grand Marquee, erected every year since 1912 by Pigott Brothers of Ongar. The marquee houses 187 exhibitors of flowers, fruits and vegetables, and 250,000 people will pass through during the course of the week to gaze and gasp and say, gosh, as they've never said it before. Amateur and professional florists from all over the country compete for trophies, while from further afield, exhibitors have been shipping and flying in the fruits of their labours from France, Holland, Jersey, Guernsey, South Africa, Mauritius, Belgium and Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, the Windward Islands and Wigan, and for the first time ever, the Garden Club of America. Chelsea has always been a social event, but this year the charity premiere gave it added sparkle. A royal presence, silver trays of canapes, and that perfect accompaniment, A glass of chilled champagne made it a matchless mixture. The Royal Parks are regular gold medal winners, and their banks of pastel-shaded border plants caught the attention of the Princess of Wales. Bailiff of the Royal Parks, Ashley Stevenson, explains this tribute to the partnership of gardener Gertrude Jekyll and architect Sir Edwin Lutyens. And the roses, who knows whether they'll be planted this autumn in the garden at Highgrove. The warm early summer evening complemented the occasion. The Chancellor of the Exchequer was there, but there was still room for another 4,000 guests to look round. The Belgium stand was one of the new circular exhibits being tried out for the first time this year and appeared to be the cause of much debate. Whatever they thought of the shape and the size, it certainly allowed plenty of room for admiration and made a few people smile as well. It's not only the professionals who exhibit at Chelsea, it's also a showcase for some of the most experienced amateurs in the country. Folk who are to be found in specialist societies like the Orchid Society of Great Britain. 300 plants put together from the collections of 33 exhibitors. And as well as competing for a Royal Horticultural Society medal, each plant is also competing for the Society's own Librarian's Cup. Last year it was won by this huge scarlet-flowered beauty. Will it win again? Well, the answer lies with the great British public. If they keep pointing to it and talking about it, it's a winner. The Orchid Society exhibit at Chelsea every year. The Alpine Garden Society only build a full-size rock garden here once every 10 years. Now, if I were to tell you that the Society had just been left £250,000 in the will of one of its ex-members, you'd say, oh, well, it's obvious, isn't it? They've used the money to build this wonderful rock garden. Not so. All they've spent on this is energy, determination, and quite a lot of sweat. There's no JCB being used here. This is purely spade work, used to show unconventional materials being used in rock garden making. On this side, tufa rock, limestone deposit stuff from North Wales and Derbyshire. Over here, railway sleepers used to support peat beds and a stream that wends its way down the track. All right, so you can't fit that in your backyard, but you could fit this on a postage stamp. Alpine's grown in a stone sink. Now, the only problem here is that the sink itself is probably going to set you back about £70 or £100. Better, perhaps, to make your own. Now, you might think that these look like stone. In fact, there's something flash called hypertufa, which is simply a mixture of equal parts sand, peat and cement. Allow it to harden and then paint it with a mixture of yoghurt and soot, and the mosses and lichens grow. Now, one of those sinks in your garden would look a treat. In front of this rock garden, the collection of them looks terrific. Who says big can't be beautiful? Now, you just won't find a better furnished hanging basket than this one, not grown by a professional, but by one of the 86 local gardening clubs throughout Britain who've entered a hanging basket and window box competition. For me, the most cheering thing about this is colour scheming. No longer do you need a riot of colour in a basket or a box. Subtlety is everything. Like this little job here, full of blue flowers, green, grey, pale yellow, soft foliage, a lot of which is herbs, which means it's fragrant as well as colourful. And the secret of success with both boxes and baskets is watering and feeding. If you want them like this, water them twice a day and feed them once a week. That way they'll keep on till the frosts of autumn. Opposite the baskets and the boxes is a series of small courtyard gardens like this one, designed and planted by Dick Sellers of the Bourne Garden Club in Lincolnshire. It's what you might call beauty on a budget. The trellis work surrounding the garden was once the old floor of the village hall, which Dick bought for 25 quid, sawed up, nailed together and painted. Here it is. The door at the back is from an old chicken coop. The wheel in the middle is an old seed drill, and it's been planted up with herbs to make a sort of herbal clock. As for the statues, well, they nearly caused a divorce in the Sellers family because Dick paid 100 quid for them at Chelsea about 10 years ago. He took them home, and his wife, who'd been pulling radishes for about a month, was absolutely furious. What, she said, spend all my life pulling radishes for you to buy statues? Not bloody likely, but I think now they've appeared in Dick's own garden at Chelsea, she might be a bit pleased.
Oh, some cracking stuff here. Great big Bramley apples, lovely watercress, mushrooms and herbs. Those British growers can find some stuff when they really want to. But Tessa Crago here has been working for the NFU for over 14 years. Tessa, do growers have to keep moaning about lack of profits?
Well, they can make profits by finding new varieties, keeping the freshness and getting the produce to market. Here we try to demonstrate exactly what we can do with horticultural produce grown in Britain.
But is it just quality? I mean, is that the only source of profit?
No, the growers are constantly looking for things to interest the consumer. There's a new apple here, John O'Gold. Nice apple, almost as good as the Cox, but that's my favourite.
They've got a rather special climate too. Being an island, it's a maritime climate, and it slopes south, giving that lovely warm conditions for early crops. Just the place for these Jersey royal potatoes coming early onto the market and finding a niche of high price that autumn, cauliflower and parsley. Get ahead of the rest and you get that extra cash. Oh, these little cherry tomatoes grown under glass in Guernsey. Beautiful. Actually, they call them vineries, not greenhouses, because in Guernsey, the island tends to slope to the north. And just before the Second World War, they were growing grapes there. Then when crops came in from the Mediterranean cheaper, they changed to tomatoes, and then more recently introduced flowers and all kinds of ornamental crops. But they're also looking for exotic fruits, nothing more exotic than the babaco from Ecuador. It's only in the 70s that we were introduced with this, and as the fruit ripens, it can be used for all kinds of different recipes. And here's a spread to tickle the taste buds and give you some little idea of what can be done with this quite exotic, succulent fruit. Mr. Ken Muir has been growing strawberries for 20 years. Is this a sort of place where everybody comes homing in?
Yes, it is, Peter, yes. We get the royal family here and hundreds of people grandstand.
Not people sort of pinching and snicking the odd fruit, I hope.
Oh, well, people do, yes, they do.
Now, what about these towers? Because we read a lot about strawberry barrels. Is this a better system?
This is much better because it's very positive. You've got no problems with overwatering or the plants getting too dry because every level has its own filling point and reservoir.
Now, I understand the staff tell me that this end of your exhibit is always your responsibility. Now, why is that?
That's right, but I don't relish doing the job, I can tell you, but I really like to make quite sure that the plants are properly bedded in, just as if it was a commercial exhibit.
So it's just as they would grow in the field?
That's right.
And
yes.
They smell marvellous.
Don't they?
Paris might be the place for spring fashions in terms of haute couture. Chelsea is most definitely the place for spring fashions in terms of horticulture. It's here that trends are set and fashions are reflected, nowhere more so than in this garden. The Sunday Times newspaper organised a competition whereby their readers were exhorted to send in designs for a period garden. The winner was Jean Stone with her Victorian garden, which not only reflects the rusticity of the period, but also today's important issue of conservation. At the back of the garden, a Victorian stumpery, replete with those ferns that the Victorians adored. Behind me, a feature which I wish we saw more of today. It's unjustly neglected, the colonnade. Larch poles linked with swags of thick rope, along which are trained climbing roses. And leaning on the rustic bridge of larch poles. These, though, when growing in the wild, had honeysuckle running up them, and it's created this spiral pattern. Now, in my neck of the woods down in Hampshire, these are known as witch sticks, and they're meant to repel all kinds of evil spirits. I should think this rustic adornment for a home of taste, the gate, would do that as well. Wonderfully knotted piece of wood worked into its centre. There's even a home here for your best friend. Mind you, I think the name's a bit of a nerve. Conservation on a worldwide scale is being reflected too. No longer are conservatory manufacturers working strictly with tropical hardwoods. They're conserving those tropical rainforests by working, in this case, with American oak. And this beauty will set you back a cool £28,000. Now, you might say, what has chopping down American oak trees and British larch trees got to do with conservation? But they're both renewable resources. They can be cropped and replanted without destroying a long-term habitat. The same is true of Somerset withies, those willow ones that have been cropped from the Somerset levels for donkey's years. I'm sitting in a withy chair, we know it as wickerwork, in the shade of a wickerwork summer house, all made by the English Basket Centre. They're in a garden designed by Alan Sargent for McAlpine Homes. He wanted a peaceful, tranquil and shady spot. He's got the shade on a hot day like this, underneath the withy arbour. You wend your way around a slate path, down a slabbed stairway here, past the trickling stream, and down to this bit of withy sculpture. Now, if you're looking for a name for her, I suppose you might say she could be called Mrs. Michael Caine or Mrs. Alan Wicker. She was in fact made by Madeline Gould, and when Alan went to collect her, she was sitting on this tree stump in a bluebell glade in a woodland with a shaft of sunlight striking her head, on which was a chain of daisies. Well, there are lots of daisies and lots of wildflowers at Chelsea Flower Show this week, marking British Wildflower Week. You can gaze through red campions and buttercups onto a tranquil pool in the Daily Express garden, and behind it huge chunks of rock and a stream flowing down. On a hot and sunny day, it's somewhere every Englishman wants to sit, in a little bit of heaven.
And now it's time